There aren't many of those.
Holy mackerel. What did they get him for? Just financial
Just,
shenanigans? or-
yeah, the kind of shenanigans that,
Yeah.
you know, the guys that finally moved across into Mexico
Yeah.
were doing, you know, just
Yeah.
totally outrageous,
Yeah.
fraudulent
Yeah, stuff, right.
representations using a license for
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Ugh. That's great. I'll find them. So you're not just interested in things I might find about while I was here, but
Oh,
later
no,
on, yeah.
no, we're, you know, I think your
Yeah.
story goes,
Yeah.
I think the rationale for it being in this collection is that,
Yeah.
first, you're an Iowa native, and unlike
Yeah.
Swanson and Jensen and some of the others
Yeah.
who made terrific places for
Yeah.
themselves in broadcasting, but didn't have,
Yeah.
didn't have their birth roots in Iowa,
No,
and,
that's
and
true.
you do.
You know, Steve Bell did you know Steve, or know of him?
I know the name.
Yeah, well, I think he was at, I think he was in Des Moines.
Was he? I
Yeah,
never
back
heard.
about that. Well, Steve became a correspondent and anchor for ABC
Yeah.
for many years.
Mhm.
And he's now he's at Ball State.
Oh, yeah.
But I thought it seems to me that I thought he did some broadcasts.
Had an Iowa
Maybe I'm wrong.
connection,
Yeah.
yeah.
Anyway.
Well, you know,
Yeah.
but one of my themes on this is that people who it's just remarkable the careers that you and others have carved out of early experience at WMT and WHO. Just those two, well, of course, they
Yeah.
were the bellwether stations.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, just story after story after story
Yeah.
of achievement coming out of that, which is pretty fundamental journalism,
Well,
Iowa
absolutely.
experience.
Or you've had people that have gone on, in the case of Jim Borman, for example, to the Twin Cities.
Well, and Borman was the architect of the, Gordon hired him in the mid-1940s.
Right.
And really up to that, well, Bill says in the interview, he didn't really know what we were doing.
Yeah.
And so we hired Jim Borman, and Bill's words, best thing we ever did. Best thing we ever did.
Yeah.
And then Borman molded that radio news department. Cheverton took that base and molded the television news department. And those two, just remarkable stories.
Well, you helped more than a little, I think.
Well,
You came along.
I had a, you know, but I inherited a foundation and kind of rode herd on taking it into what was that incredible decade of the 60s.
Boy, those 4 years that I was there were just incredible. I remember Bob, the mayor of Cedar Rapids, Johnson, used to say, with a touch of irony and somewhat snidely, something about WMT and Grant Price's bright young men, you know? And knowing Johnson, you know, I mean, those guys are, you know, they're after me again, you know.
Well,
but it was with admiration.
Right. Right.
And you know, with everybody we had, including you, among the bright young man, and you know, and Swanson and Jensen,
and Jensen,
yeah, it was it was an incredible team.
Right. And you know,
and Jim Ryman was a wonderful editorial cameraman. I mean, in addition to being, you know, a cameraman and stuff, and with his background and everything, he just was, you know, he could go off and he could get an interview on his own that I couldn't get.
You know, and again, I'll just, I guess you underestimate people.
Yeah.
And I love Jim. You know, what little I ever knew about photography, I learned from Jim Ryman. I didn't know a damn thing about it. You know, when I took over that news, I was a radio, you know, a on-the-job trained radio news director, And here I'm thrust into managing this television news operation.
That's right.
And Jim just held my hand, this is the end that you point at.
And he learned that everything that he knew behind bars.
Right.
Because that was the best deal that you could get at Animalista.
Yeah.
If you could get him in retirement.
That's right.
That's what he did. Jim was an operator.
Right.
And that's how he learned to cook.
I
He's an amazing guy.
remember him coming into my office, and he said, I just valued him so much for what he was doing. And he said, I said, I want to do some stories. And I said, are you, and I had prejudged the fact that I didn't think probably he had a very adequate education base to take what he knew into the writing dimension and so on. Well, I had to think pretty hard about it. Well,
Absolutely.
I said, if you want to try, go, okay, let's see what you can do.
Yeah.
And he went from there.
Good for
and
you.
He was doing his own,
Yeah.
he was, he didn't have the background skills that you and the others had.
But he had a lot of people skills that I must say I never had.
Right. And then he took that and parlayed it into the news directorship.
He was running news director, in Denver.
Denver.
Yeah. Amazing.
Amazing.
I'll bet you would like this to stop
Are you rolling?
Yep,
reminiscing here and get to work.
He's
All right.
been rolling. He's way
fine.
ahead of
If I
us.
can just have you move your mic, it's kind of hearing a rustle, if you can move it up a little bit.
Oh.
And if you could move yours up just a little
Yeah,
bit more.
sure.
That'd be great. Good.
Okay.
We'll stop the
Keep
rustling
talking
here,
about my-
Jason.
No more rustling.
All right.
Okay, well, are you set?
Yep, go ahead.
Well, this is a broadcasting history interview with my colleague from many years ago, Richard Threlkeld, which we're doing on the 27th of October in
29th.
29th, of 2002. And I think I'd like to start, Dick, with going back to the fact that you are a native of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, by birth and early family experience.
I was born in St. Luke's Hospital, November 30th, 1937. Lived there off and on for a short time until I was about 4. And we moved to the Chicago area where I essentially grew up, and came back to Cedar Rapids for the first time in the fall of 1961, shortly out of Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, and having spent several months at WHAS in Louisville, Kentucky, a CBS affiliate, and where you were kind enough to give me a job. I had been there about a week and was, having been away from Iowa a long time, was not as familiar with the WMT listening area, as we then referred to it, as I might have been. You let me, probably against your better judgment, do some radio afternoon local newscasts, and on one of them I pronounced the name of a city just to the east of Cedar Rapids as Makokeda. After the broadcast was over, the phone rang, and it was a fellow that I'd never heard of by the name of Bill Corton, who said, "Mr. Threlkeld, I'm the manager of the station," and I immediately paid attention, and he said, that the name that you pronounced of the town east of Cedar Rapids is actually Makokeda. I said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry." He said, if I may suggest that you get yourself a gazetteer, which is in the library at WMT, and go through it, because it has the pronunciations of the various towns in the WMT listening area, and memorize it, and then come back on my air. Would you be kind enough to do that? And I said, "Yes, sir," and that was that.
And this is the legendary Bill Corton, who was William B. Corton, the architect of that powerful radio station, which grew into a powerful television station known as the WMT stations in Cedar Rapids, Iowa.
That's right.
Incidentally, I made the same mistake I called it Macokita about 10 years earlier when I came from Sioux City to eastern Iowa.
I can see Bill Corton rolling his eyes right now and saying, "Oh, another one."
No, I didn't do it on his time.
Oh,
it was
I
on the
see.
previous watch.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, so there is a Threlkeld family history in Cedar Rapids, and
There is. We'd been there for a couple of generations, I guess. And my then wife's family had a long history in Cedar Rapids, which was part of what brought us back. But I also was aware of WMT's reputation among broadcast journalists, believe it or not, and that was the fact that I had an opportunity to do some reporting.
and also do some television.
And television broadcasting at a local station, and a very good one, was in no small part a factor in my decision to see if I could find a job there.
And your educational background then is was a bachelor's arts degree from Ripon College?
From Ripon College, I have a BA from Ripon College in Wisconsin, and then I went on to do graduate work at Medill in broadcasting, Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. So I had the academic credentials by the time I got to WMT. It's just, as I'm sure you found out, I wasn't quite sure how the cameras worked.
A lot of details,
yeah,
although...
those newspaper guys had
right.
it easy because they had a pencil and a piece of paper, but
And one of your classmates at Medill was another well-known WMT personality.
yeah, whose name was and is Ron Gonder, who, of course, for many, many years was the principal sports person at WMT Radio and Television.
Right. Well, at WMT Radio and Television, we did both radio and television out of one newsroom, and as you gained experience, you found yourself doing some, well, for example, beat coverage of City Hall, looking over the mayor's shoulder, and
it was a remarkable time. WMT had been around for close to 40 years by then. It was, if not the first, one of the first stations, not only in eastern Iowa, but in that whole section of the Midwest. It's the radio spot on the dial, 600, and the fact that it was clear channel meant that it, and I can testify to this, on some dark winter nights with the skip pattern, you can pick it up in Lubbock, Texas. Mm-hmm. So it had a very long broadcast history and a huge reputation in Iowa. I mean, it basically ruled the market, as they say. And when television, as you know, came along, WMT was basically first on the air in the area and built up this enormous audience and equally important, and perhaps consequently, an enormously valuable reputation as a purveyor of basic information.
Iowans, you could trust.
Yeah, well, information you could trust, but a lot of people don't realize that not only Iowans, but Nebraskans and Kansans and people in the Midwest are extraordinarily sophisticated about world events. Much more so than somebody in California or New York would imagine. And the reason that they are is that what they sell goes overseas. And the wheat and the corn and the soybeans that they sell goes all over the world. And they have to know, because their income and their lives and their livelihood depends on it, what this political situation is in Russia or China, what's going on in the Appropriations Committee of the House, because that's going to be whether the Farm Bill is passed. That's going to be whether there's a market in East Germany for what they sell. And so people would tune in and demand trustworthy information, and lots of it, not just about Iowa, but about the rest of the world, and WMT was able to provide that.
Right. course, we were doing television with 16 millimeter film then, which was a lot of fun, which I don't think either you or I would want to go back to.
Well, the difficulty that I had, and I think everybody had, was some of the equipment we had was double sprocketed. Particularly we had sound film. This was long before tape, and the film was on a little piece of the sound was on a little piece of tape at the edge of the film, so that
Magnetic stripe.
the sound would be recorded on the magnetic stripe at the same time the picture was being exposed, and some of the film was double sprocketed, so that when you edit it, you were never sure unless you looked carefully. If you flipped it over by mistake, everything was backwards and upside down. And it made for some very interesting newscasts when I was doing the editing. I think the then anchorman, Bob Bruner, almost physically beat me up 2 or 3 nights because I made him look like such an idiot.
Very, very cumbersome technological process.
But we got it done, and we were still, when I was there, we were still taking still pictures with a Brownie Hawkeye camera and printing them up and putting them as basically newspaper pictures on television. We would go out, and instead of taking film pictures with a little Filmo silent camera, because maybe it was busy.
we only had one.
We only had one. I would take the Brownie out, and I would go to the scene of the guy who flipped his pickup truck, and I would take some still pictures and run back to the studio and put them into the soup, and so we'd have still pictures on.
And I notice in scripts that you brought along with you that some of the work that you did there was when we were still using what we called negative film, which was processed to a negative.
And then it had to be polarized, and so it would be polarized as it ran through the projector.
Right.
If the lamp was working, otherwise everything came out black and white the other way.
Yeah. Well, those are just kind of, but we'll get on into your later very impressive achievements in journalism at the network level with the CBS and ABC. But think back with me for a little bit on some of those stories that you covered back there at Channel 2.
Well, I always remember, I guess, because it's natural, the things that I did and the stories that I did where I embarrassed everybody. There was a terrible plane crash in southern Iowa. It turned out somebody put a bomb on board in the early 60s, so that terrorist bombs are nothing new. And it blew up this airliner and killed everybody on board. And I went running down there with my Filmo camera and my tape recorder and my Brownie Hawkeye, and everybody else, you know, the networks were there, and the New York Times was there, and the Des Moines Register was there, and I was this kid with all these big important reporters and doing the best I could at doing interviews and running around. And I finished my story and stopped at a barn to put everything together and put it back in the car and went dashing back to make the 10 o'clock news on WMT with everything. And it happened that there was that night a tornado between Wapello and Iowa City, and I drove right through that tornado. There were trees falling, and boy, am I a great journalist, you know, because I'm going to make it with it. Yeah. And I got to the station, and the guy at the lab and photographer Carol Derringer said, "Oh, you're back. That's great. We just got time. We'll put it." And where's the film? And I said, "It's right. I've got the film. Let me. I know it's here." I had left the film in the barn in southeast Iowa and come back with a tape recorder and my Brownie Hawkeye. So we processed the film, and we had stills that night with the tape recorder. So they did make something of it, but that was my first experience covering a plane crash. So in many respects, painfully enough, for WMT, my apprenticeship there was a learning experience.
Well, but here, you know, it was a small staff. Here's a big story, and I'm sure that You were the person that was available, and so you went on your own with a Bell and Howell camera and a box brownie and a tape recorder.
I was sent down by WMT in 1961 or 62 to Fort Madison to cover the last execution that Iowa ever had,
Yeah.
which was a double execution of 2 murderers. And at that point, Iowa still did execution by hanging.
Mm-hmm.
They hung these fellows in a section of the prison where the auto repair shop was, and set up a scaffold right out of some John Ford Western.
Yeah.
Double scaffold for reasons I, to this day, don't understand. They let the press, including me, come in and witness it,
Yeah.
in addition to the legal witness. So and I don't think that would ever happen again. I don't know why they did, but I watched the execution, which was from me to that wall over there. They dropped the boards both at the same time. One of the fellow's neck was broken and he died immediately. The other fellow's neck was not broken and he strangled to death, and it took him a couple of minutes. I have been a deadly opponent of capital punishment since that morning.
Mm-hmm. And my recollection of that, Dick, and I don't think there's anything macabre about it, that you requested that assignment because you wanted to be where the story was, and
It was the best story at least in Iowa and maybe in the country that morning.
Well, it was a very, it was the last execution in Iowa, and you were there, and it was a very significant story, as well as a terrible human experience.
Well, I mean, but we've all been through terrible stories, but it's not all of them affect your feeling about a certain subject for the rest of your life, and that did.
Yeah.
The Amish school controversy, where the state wanted to insist that certified teachers be brought in to teach Amish school children, and the religious objections that their parents had, was a huge story, and WMT distinguished itself with its daily coverage and with award-winning documentaries on that subject. And we did what a good local station and newspaper ought to do. We went out every day and did the grunge work, which for me was fun, of covering the Board of Supervisors every day, the police department every day, the mayor's office every day, and letting people know what government was doing.
Right.
And
that found its way into the newscasts on a daily basis.
Absolutely,
Right.
both on radio and television,
Right.
and we made room for it,
Right.
and we did that rather than do other stories, which might have proved more interesting to people. But we resolved that old journalism argument about what people ought to be told and be allowed to see, and what they want to see and hear, in favor of the former, and
Because
that was a good thing.
The thing people need to see.
Yeah.
Right. Let's go back just a little bit to the Amish school controversy. You became a national story. One of the reasons is because very powerful visual images came out of what was sort of the climactic event in that story, which had gone on for weeks and months. All of a sudden, the Old Wine School District decided to force the issue and came down to collect these Amish kids from their country school with a bus. And what happened?
A yellow school bus. And predictably enough, I suppose, the children fled. And as so often, particularly in television, a story becomes perhaps important in an outsized way from a picture. And the picture was, and we had it on film, and the national newspapers had it in still, of these children running away into a cornfield in their Amish clothing from these truant officers, in effect.
Right.
And it was a very moving picture. And you know, there are pictures that stick in people's mind that encapsulate the stories. The picture of John Kennedy saluting the passing casket of his father in 1963, and for me it's because I was there the day it happened. In 1972, a little Vietnamese girl out on Highway 1 whose clothes had been burned off by napalm, running down the road, and she's coming toward the camera, and she's naked, and you see the napalm explosion behind her.
Right.
That sort of said everything you needed to know about the Vietnam War. That little girl survived and is alive and reasonably well, by the way. But I was there the day that happened, and so much of what the viewers of WMT remember in their lives about what went on is some flash frames of pictures of different stories, and that's, as a journalist, that's what I remember.
And those visual images do override any of the other senses. I want to belabor this, but as we move on, I want to note that in this reunion that we've had here today, and you and I haven't seen each other in face to face for
right.
I don't know how many years. It's but in your files you found the script for a half-hour documentary program.
In Iowa, we did, called the State and the Plain People, I think.
Which was a really in-depth examination of this. It was much more than Amish kids running into the cornfield. It was a showdown between this very simple way of life and the state's authority to impose certain regulations. And out of that came, through the good offices of the then Governor Harold Hughes, the Hughes exception for these folks to do less than meet the rigid requirements.
It was a humanitarian response that I would like to think any good governor in his right mind would have accorded these people.
Yeah.
But having spent a lot of years with governors one place or another, I think perhaps only Harold Hughes had the wisdom at the time to do the kind of humanitarian thing that he did, because it was silly to do it any other way.
Right. They were not going to give up.
And cruel, no.
Right. The fathers were, well, we won't.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, it's great to have that record of that work that you did.
Well, it's what that documentary showed, among other things, was that stories are very complicated, that they usually have many more facets and much grander themes around them than just the facts, than just the kids in the cornfield and the people chasing them. As you say, it was a clash of styles, of life, of history, and it involved public policy. And the fact that we did that documentary, in part, changed public policy because it focused public attention and the spotlight of publicity on a situation, and it made the political system stand up and look at it and do something about it. That's the importance and the potential of television news broadcasting. One, to tell a larger story and to have the advantage of pictures, which, as we've said, can be riveting, and to change public policy. The tragedy is that that's not nearly practiced as much as we would all like it these days. There aren't the documentaries anymore that there used to be. There isn't the time spent on news broadcasting to do those kinds of stories in that kind of depth and with that kind of editorial background that leads to a change in public policy.
And I think that's why it's important for us to have this conversation with you as a practitioner who got your early sort of grounding experience in a news operation where the management allowed us not only to do these daily newscasts, but stretch resources to where we could do a half-hour documentary when the subject warranted it.
The nice thing about WMT, and for that matter, the other stations in the area, the KCRG, the Cedar Rapids Gazette station, KWWL, was that they were all essentially locally owned.
Right.
That is to say that the managers, if not the owners, had been there for many years. It was their station. It wasn't some corporation station. And they really, the owners, had a stake in the station. They lived in the community, at least the managers did, and they went to the country club, and they went to the parties, and the people would say, their friends, oh, gee, that was a nice piece about that, or gee, why did you say that?
Yeah.
That was the stupidest editorial I've ever seen. Their reputation depended in large part upon people's perception of their station, and their perception was in the main their perception of the news department.
Right.
And so news was very important, and there was a commitment to it. As we all know, over the years, that changed, and stations became just a small cog in a large corporation, usually run by managers who don't live there, and really have only the stock market and quarterly earnings reports to answer to, and therefore don't care about the news and could care less about the particular reputation of their station in any one town, if the numbers are right.
And you just described what's going on today in 2002.
Yeah, I mean, we can all be curmudgeons and say, gee, it's not like it used to be.
Yeah.
And it isn't, and in some ways, it is better. There is, we didn't do as much relevant news as perhaps we should have. I mean, we should have done more stories about health and lifestyles, because people, let's face it, are interested in that, and that can be a contribution,
Right.
that your doctor thinks you should do this or that. And when I go around, and even these days, despite the depths that local television news has fallen to in many respects, I still find very, very bright young people who are very qualified, who are very smart and very talented, and they would just love to be unleashed
Right.
to do the kind of
yes.
things that we had. So
Right.
in many respects, I think television news is as good and potentially as good as it ever was. It just isn't given the opportunity to be the best it can be.
Because of the priorities that ownership
Yeah.
is placing on it. Well, we do need to, there's a lot to be told in this story. Let's go across the bridge that got you from that CBS affiliated station in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and then was probably about the 80th television market.
Mm-hmm.
And you had an opportunity through, again, these were the days when CBS really was the Tiffany network, and it did things that I think were characterized by that.
Well, I
term.
always wanted to be a CBS correspondent. I fell in love with Edward R. Murrow and Charles Collingwood and all those guys. They were my heroes when I was growing up, and as I'm sure young people today think of Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings. I had an opportunity being a news man at a CBS affiliate to get a CBS, what was then a CBS News fellowship to Columbia University, and to apply for that, and I did, and got to spend a year at Columbia University, and more importantly, a year talking regularly with CBS News executives. And WMT was kind enough to let me go off and do that, and eventually that, in 1966, led to a job for me at CBS News on the assignment desk. In those years, actually the Walter Cronkite Evening News was number 2. Huntley Brinkley at NBC ran the show, and then about the time I got there, by 1968, Walter had begun to turn things around, and for the next 20 years, Walter Cronkite was number 1, and NBC was number 2, but there was always, it was rather like WMT and KCRG
Right.
in Cedar Rapids. There was a fierce competition, which was good for everybody.
Yeah, right.
And CBS and NBC, ABC wasn't much of a factor then, until later. They had a fierce competition. So I was there in New York, and then ultimately went a couple of years later to Los Angeles in the Hollywood Bureau as a producer. A reporter, was there for a while, then went to Vietnam from 1968 to through 1970, and became a correspondent. Went to San Francisco for 7 years as the West Coast correspondent for CBS, and also went back to Vietnam a couple of times. Then went to Rome for a year and became the Vatican correspondent for a year, and then spent a couple of years anchoring the CBS Morning News with Leslie Stahl. Started a program called Sunday Morning with Charles Kuralt, and was there for a time. Then I went off to ABC News for 8 years during the 80s, and did some things for their evening show and Nightline. Came back to CBS just as the Soviet Union was falling and Eastern Europe was being liberated in 1989, and by this time I'd met my wife, Betsy Aaron, and she and I covered the liberation of Eastern Europe and the fall of the Soviet Union and the Gulf War. Betsy was in Baghdad during the Gulf War, and I was with the Marines in Kuwait when we liberated Kuwait City. And then one thing and another, during the 1990s, Betsy and I worked for CBS and other people, and 1996 we both had an opportunity to go to Moscow, to Russia, for 3 years. And Betsy is the CNN correspondent, and myself is the CBS News correspondent. Did that until 1999, and then we moved to Tucson.
And now, and so that's, well, that's a really nice synopsis of your career. Now let me take you back to, you left, you finished up the CBS fellowship in about 65?
I finished in the summer of 65. They offered me a job, but said it wasn't ready yet. And but in the meantime, would I like to be a writer for the CBS television station in New York? Well, I had a wife and 2 kids by then, and so I said, well, I'll try it. And I wrote for their 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock news for a while, like 2 weeks, and I decided that wasn't my cup of tea. So I called the U and WMT up and said, help, take me back. Your ex wants you back. And so you were kind enough to let me come back for 6 months with the understanding that I probably wouldn't be there for too long. And got me gainfully employed for 6 months until December of 65, when CBS called and said, we finally found a job for you to come to New York, and that was it.
The point I'd like to make, so as recently as 65, you were still reporting local Eastern Iowa news on WMT in Cedar Rapids, and by 68, you were in the thick of this god-awful thing that was going on in Vietnam.
Yeah,
as
I
a
missed the
network
Tet
correspondent.
offensive. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I wasn't then. What happened in those years was, and it was a very good thing, you were hired as basically a reporter, but really more of a producer. And you worked off the CBS assignment desk in New York, and you basically learned the system. It was really like joining the military. It was described then to me as a paramilitary organization, not with the terrible connotations that word is now brought, but a semi-military organization. And you learned that when your producer told you to do something, you did it, and you didn't ask questions, and you learned how the film got shipped from here to there, and how you got it on planes and got it off planes, and who the stringer
all of those logistics
in Colombo, Sri Lanka was, and so forth, because you were on the phone with them. And gradually they let you do stories, when nobody else was around. And if you did pretty well at that, then they'd ship you off someplace else. In my case, I went to Los Angeles and basically did the same thing. I was mostly a producer for the correspondence there, but once in a while they would throw me a bone, and I would get to go off and do this story. And I was good enough at that I called up one day in 1968 after the Tet Offensive, because that was the best story in the world going,
Yeah.
and I wanted to be part of it.
You want to be where the story was.
Yeah, even though I had a wife and 2 kids, and they said, gee, you know, we were just, you know, they were really they'd been running through correspondence, and they were doing 6-month tours, and I agreed to go for a couple of years, and they said, fine, we'd love to have you, and so they packed my wife and kids up, and we moved to Singapore the next week, and I was basically there for about 2.5 years, and then went back later on. But and at that point, I went as a correspondent. Was made a correspondent.
So you were there in a producer role initially.
Yeah, they really didn't have room by that time for producers. I
Right,
mean, you just went and went out and you did radio and you did television and you went out with a cameraman and a Vietnamese sound man and you basically looked for people shooting at each other because that you tried to do other stuff, but what they wanted was you know, we snicker at television news today, which features auto accidents and so forth, but in those years what we wanted to feature, the networks wanted to feature, was people shooting at each other. They wanted what became known as bang bang. They wanted combat, and so that's what you went out and got.
Well, whatever the motivation may have been on that, the results of it were blood and guts on the evening news 7 nights a week in America.
Except that actually finding combat was pretty hard to do. And if you go back, as many people have, and look at dispassionately the coverage, what you find is that most of it is not bang bang, that most of it is feature stories about GIs and Vietnamese, which are very pro-American and somewhat excessively so, I think, often a pro-GI, pro-war effort. Most of the fellows who, including me, who went over there really until late in the war, basically thought we were doing the right thing. And it was only when you got over there, and this is the newspaper fellows found that out first, you got over there and you just got on the ground and you realized it just wasn't working and it wasn't ever going to work for any one of a number of reasons. And I think that affected how you began to write your stories. Not that you're saying it doesn't work, but to try to tell the truth, you began to say, I've got to show people that when these Vietnamese troops go into a village, they rape the women and they take all of their pigs and cattle and they burn all of their crops, and these people are not necessarily Viet Cong sympathizers, and they behave horribly, and you have to tell people that the local province chief is corrupt and takes taxes from these people, and you have to tell those things, and that's not being anti-war. That's just telling the truth.
But Lyndon Johnson and company really didn't want to hear that kind of reporting.
No, they didn't. I had done a few stories on anti-war demonstrations in San Francisco prior to going to Vietnam, just because I was the San Francisco correspondent, or one of them, and there were stories up there we had to do. And I had no idea that Lyndon Johnson watched 3 television sets with all 3 then network news on every night simultaneously, and knew everything that anybody said about him or the war, and memorized it. And I went off with CBS to Honolulu because Johnson was going on a Southeast Asian trip to drum up support for the war in 1967. And we were at a reception in Honolulu for the president, and I was there with one of the White House correspondents, whose name was Mariah McLaughlin, a lovely woman, and she said to me, "Would you like to come over and meet the president?" And I said, "Gee, Lyndon Johnson, wow." So I went over and I came up to this very tall man who was as tall as Ron Gonder, but bigger. And and she got his attention and said, "Mr. President, this is," and he looked down at me and he said, "Ah, no." And I put my hand out to shake it, and he did not shake it. And there's pictures of Johnson doing this, but he would use his height to bend people down. In other words, you'd be here, and he'd lean over you, and he would literally bend you backwards. And so his head, his eyes were about this far away from your forehead. And he bent me down, and he said, and I'm going to clean this up a little for television.
Yeah.
He said, "Are you trying to screw me, boy?"
Yeah.
And I was terrified, and I said, "No, Mr. President." I had no idea what he was talking about. And he'd seen these little anti-war pieces, that coverage things I'd done. And he said, very quietly, "Well, I think you're trying to screw me, and I do not appreciate it." And he turned around and walked off. That was the last I ever saw of Lyndon Johnson. I was terrified. To me, a little bitty network reporter, you know,
Incredible
just
story.
got yelled at by the President of the United States.
But it's symbolizes that awful struggle that was going on between a political regime that was trying to hang on to a course that they had charted, and the fact that it was crumbling underneath them, which you were reporting from the field.
Yeah, and they figured, you know, that as presidencies and governorships and mayoralties, anybody in power often do, they equate criticism with personal vendettas, because they come from a world of criticism and vendettas, and so they figure that sometimes it's true, but usually when newspaper or television people give them unwelcome news, it's nothing personal, you know. In this case, it wasn't anything personal, but Johnson never believed that. He always believed, unfortunately, that somebody was, including the press, was out to get him, and they were misreporting the story or whatever, and of course they weren't.
Well, again, I think most of us who were living very comfortable lives during all of those years, and that was part of what was wrong with it, of course, but in the meantime, Richard, who wants to be where the story is, kept going back there, and you hung on until the final ignominious conclusion of that whole sorry story.
Well, I knew the story, and you develop friendships there, and it had been the best story in the world, and you want to see the end of it, whether it's the Amish school crisis or you know, you're following a bill through the legislature. I mean, you want to see how it. And there's a certain, I must say, that for many of us who have covered combat for a living, that there is a certain almost narcotic effect. You're drawn almost like a moth to a flame. There's when you're in very great danger, and it's a steady diet of it. You get a little addicted to it, and I'm not sure why. I've never quite figured that out. But when you're away from it, and there's an opportunity to go back and do it again, you do. And I think that's what kept drawing me back to Vietnam. That and the fact that it was a story that I knew. I loved the country, I loved the people, and it was the best story around.
And then this brings you into the mid-70s, and you, as you look over this career that you synopsized for us here, what are a couple of the other, of course, more recently you were among the first correspondents to reach Kuwait with American forces.
Well, I was very fortunate. I convinced CBS to set up a network bureau in San Francisco when I got back from Vietnam in 1970, and I was there for 7 years. Ultimately, the other networks realized what a good idea that was, and they set up their own bureaus. But that 7 years was just an incredible period in San Francisco and Northern California. There was the Patty Hearst kidnapping. There were any number of, you know, for journalists at least, the troubles at anti-war protests and things at Berkeley and San Francisco State, and it just, you know, it went on and on and on. One you know, the Black Panthers, you know, you know, all of the things which give Americans headaches, but for a journalist like me, I mean, it was an absolutely wonderful story. It just was one thing after another until 1977, then I had a chance to go off to Italy for a year, to Rome, and I did that, and then I'd always wanted to be a European correspondent. I really wanted to be the Rome correspondent, and I finally got to be, and I'd been there for less than a year, and they called me one day and said, "You've got to come back to New York and co-anchor the morning news with Leslie Stahl." If that had happened today, I would have called I didn't want to come back.
Yeah.
I would have called my agent and said, tell them to stuff it. And the agent would have called and they would have stuffed it. Not in those years.
Yeah.
CBS in those years, 25 years ago, was a semi-military organization. And when the boss called and said, this is what you do, you just did it. You just said, yes, sir. You just never even questioned it. And I was on the next plane. And so I, against my will, went back. But the good news was that week I met Betsy Aaron, who later became my wife, and so it all worked out.
Well, it also then led into what must have been a pretty incredible 3 years working with that man, Threlkeld.
Charles Threlkeld I have several heroes in this business. You're one. Walter Cronkite is one. A guy by the name of Dick Salant, who was the best network news president who ever lived. And Threlkeld, each in their own way, are my heroes. And Threlkeld and I started this, they gave CBS an hour and a half, the news department an hour and a half on Sunday because they didn't know what to do with it. And from 9 to 10:30. And so a very talented executive producer by the name of Shad Northshield put this show together, and we were about ready to get fired from the morning news, Leslie and I, and we saw that coming, and so knew I had to, in this business, you have, like any business, you have to stay one step ahead of the guy who's going to fire you, and so they were just starting this, and I went to Northshield and said, listen, I've got this idea to do, since we've got all this time, to do this sort of cover story every week, and which will take the best story of the week, and we'll do what we did with the Amish school story. We'll just background it and foreground it, and we'll find a new way to look at it and turn it upside down. And it turned out Threlkeld had done that several years previously with a program called Eyewitness, which was a 1 hour thing. But anyway, they were looking for ideas, and they said, great, so that became the cover story on Sunday morning, and that was a wonderful period because you could really go any place in the world, although most of it was in the U.S. because it really was an American show, and do anything and say anything, and you got 12 minutes a week to do it. The only thing you had to do was do a good job.
Yeah, and find
That's all
good
anybody
stories.
Yeah, and find good stories,
Right,
and or find interesting new ways to do stories that had happened that week. We tried to anticipate what everybody would be talking about the next Sunday, which isn't always easy. And even though everybody had done that story, we would find a new way to do it. We'd add something to the mix.
Right. Bring texture
We'd
to
say,
it.
we'd have people say, gee, I didn't know that. That's interesting, which is what news ought to be. So it was a wonderful 3 years. And Threlkeld was, late Charles Threlkeld was a wonderful act to follow. I mean, he was the host for the show, but he also wrote the show, and except for the part I did, but he wrote the continuity around the pieces, and he really was the best broadcast writer of putting words to pictures I've ever known. I used to, when he would be on vacation, fly fishing or something, every summer, I would do the show for him for 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, and so I would get to be Charles Threlkeld for 90 minutes every Sunday, but I'd have to write the show, and Threlkeld was not an easy act to follow in that regard. And I remember the first time I did it, the end of the show was, and still is, just a little piece of 2 minutes of peace and quiet with some nature film over it, and whether it's birds or buffalo or whatever. And that was Shad Northshield's idea, just to leave people with an opportunity to take a breath after the show and look at something interesting or nice nature.
Wonderful television.
And you have to write a little 20-second introduction to what you're going to see, just to put people in mind of where you are, what you're looking at, and what you're going to see. But it's not easy. And I got stuck with something about rabbits in Idaho or something. I had no idea what to say about rabbits in Idaho. So I went back to the previous week to see what Threlkeld had written about his little thing with wildlife. And the previous week, he'd been stuck with a few leftover pictures of some blue jays in some gum trees in the Okefenokee Swamp. And so what do you say to that? What Threlkeld said was, it's spring, and the blue jays are back in the gum trees of the Okefenokee Swamp in Florida. Now that may not seem like news to you, but if you're a bug snug in a gum tree in the Okefenokee Swamp in Florida, that's a bulletin. How do you top that?
Well,
The man's a genius.
I really am just stunned by how you described him as the master of writing, especially writing for television, putting.
I think we all, as a whole generation of people, at one time tried to imitate David Brinkley, who talked like this, and everybody seemed to like the way Brinkley talked. We all, in my generation, tried to emulate Threlkeld's writing, which was simple and spare and completely tied to the picture. You let the picture carry what you're trying to say.
Well, of course, you were an exceptional writer in your own right going into that, but you had some real competition there.
I had a real wonderful teacher. I really did. So I did that, and then I went I'd done about 3 years of the Sunday morning program, and I'd really gotten to the point at CBS where the Sunday morning program was really hard because it was really 7 days a week, and it was week after week after week. And I wasn't seeing my family, I was really tired, and it was fun, but it was exhausting. And there really wasn't anything else at CBS at that point that I really wanted to do, having done most of it. And Roone Arledge was starting this really interesting broadcast experiment with a lot of money to devote to it over at ABC. And so I went over and worked with him for 8 years, both in the ABC World News Tonight and with Ted Koppel at Nightline.
During the ascendancy then of that news
and
organization.
sort of got in on the ground floor of that, and it was much like Sunday morning. It was just great to see this thing sort of invent itself, and that sort of got to be settling down to a kind of a dull roar, and the inventiveness began to kind of go out of it, at least in my mind, by the late 80s. And I'd sort of done everything over there that I wanted to do. I had a chance to go to work for some magazine shows, but I didn't like the magazine shows. The kind of stuff that they did wasn't. I'm an old-fashioned, ink-stained wretch. I'm a newsman. I mean, I need to do news stories, not stories about, somebody getting ripped off by a car salesman or something. I understand that that's perfectly good for some people, but not for me. And I didn't want to do that. And so I said thank you very much and went back to CBS just as a guy doing the evening news again, which I was very happy to do, and it turned out to be a wonderful decision because that was just at the point that Eastern Europe fell. I had just gotten back to CBS when the Soviet Union collapsed, Eastern Europe fell, and with Betsy we did that, and then the Gulf War came along, and I had an opportunity to do that, and then Bill Clinton came along, and I was fortunate enough to get that assignment. And so I spent a year and a half with the Democrats and ultimately with Clinton. And then by 1996, we had a chance to do Moscow, and that seemed ultimately a nice way to sort of cap our
Right.
careers.
You really had an extraordinary opportunity, Howard, to get very up close on the performance of most of the presidents of the United States during that period.
I did. There were a couple I missed. I missed Kennedy. I spent a lot of time. I actually covered Nixon as a journalism student in 1960, but I missed Kennedy because I was here.
Yeah.
Although I got to know Nixon a little bit because he would come to Iowa a lot after he lost the governorship in 64 to Pat Brown, and so he was on his way back, to building up campaign IOUs to various people, and so he'd come to Cedar Rapids or someplace, and we'd interview him, so forth, so on. So I got to know him, and then Johnson I met once. but
and you'll always remember
that's what
that.
I'll always remember it, so I recall him. And then Nixon came along, and spent a lot of time covering the Nixon administration, as a lot of other people did, and got to know Jerry Ford a little bit, although Betsy and I never went to Washington. We both had several opportunities to go there, and
You never were based in Washington.
we just we're just old-fashioned kind of line journalists, to tell the truth. And the problem with Washington is that it's a one-story town, and it's the president or politics.
Yeah.
And if you like that, and I like it every 4 years. I love to cover presidential campaigns. Wonderful. But I couldn't stand it every day because everybody's talking about, this senator did that to that senator, and, what somebody in the Defense Department really said about somebody in the state. I mean, I'm sure this went on in ancient Egypt, 3,000 years before Christ, but it's always the same thing. And there are some people, in the world, Bob Schieffer and Tim Russert and those guys who just live and breathe that, and they love it. That's fine for them. It's not fine for me, and it's not fine for my wife, Betsy. So we never went to Washington. So as a result, we didn't really. Betsy covered Jimmy Carter, both during the campaign and the transition era between right after he defeated Gerald Ford in 1976 and 77, and I covered Carter, and then I had covered Reagan for 4 years in California when he was governor, and then off and on covered him, but not in Washington. I wasn't the White House correspondent during his 8 years, and spent some time covering the Bush campaign, and Walter Mondale, and then Clinton, and I missed the latest Bush. Right. We were gone by the time the latest Bush came down the pipe.
Does it ever, as you reflect on this, is it kind of awesome to think about you being that close to the power that those men represented? And
oh, I don't think so. I think once you've been on a campaign plane with them, I mean, it's pretty
they
much
become mere mortals.
It's pretty much all the same. I wish it wasn't, but they're all interesting when except for the incumbents, when it first starts out, and then as they get closer and closer to being the candidate, the nominee, the bubble surrounds them, and the campaign consultants come in, so forth and so on, and you can't get close to them. The distance is impossible. I mean, our favorite, Betsy and I spent a lot of time, because we weren't as important as some of the other correspondents, in covering the lesser candidates. So we would get guys like Mo Udall, who ran for president in '76. And when he was ultimately, he had to drop out after he narrowly lost the Wisconsin primary to Jimmy Carter. Yeah, he got up and announced, "The people have spoken, the bastards." You have to love somebody like that. Or Fred Harris, who ran for president briefly and ran across the country in a Winnebago with his wife, LaDonna. And when he finally had to drop out, he said, "I asked for the votes of the little people, and they responded. It's just that they were too little to reach the voting levers." You have to love people like that. Bill Clinton would never have said anything like that. Maybe George W. Bush would have. But, so we love the lesser candidates.
Well, this unique experience that you've had, your dear wife Betsy is certainly a extremely talented and very
the brains of the
experienced,
outfit.
correspondent.
That's
and,
right.
You make quite a household.
You
I had not met Betsy until you brought her here yesterday.
Well, now you understand.
I do understand. But I think it.
Good.
But then you had this sort of this some opportunities previous to that, I guess, to be sort of billeted in the same location. But those last.
Well, we weren't together as often as we might have certainly have liked to be. We did cover some stories together, particularly at ABC. We spent a lot of time in the Middle East, a lot of time in Lebanon during the war, and we were there together in Beirut during all of those atrocities. And we spent some time together in politics and in Eastern Europe. So we would occasionally, more often, she'd be one place and I'd be the other.
Yeah.
And we treasured those times when we could be on the same story. She'd doing one show and then doing another broadcast.
But you were consistently in the same base anyway when you were the Moscow correspondent.
There wasn't a lot of Betsy did more traveling than I did. But by that time, the money crunch had descended on all of the networks, and they just that's one of the reasons I left. They just didn't want to spend the money to have you go anyplace.
Yeah.
So you basically, I could have stayed there forever, but you're basically sitting there reading the wires and making a couple of phone calls and going down to the bridge over the Moscow River in front of the Kremlin and doing a stand-up and going home. But I mean, that's not
not your
the
idea
job
of covering
description I signed up
Yeah,
for.
right.
If I can't go out and cover the story, then so that's ultimately why I left.
And that's where network news is today.
Well,
To a considerable
they
extent.
do some, it's like local news. I mean,
Again, I don't want to categorize it absolutely, but
it's not a wasteland,
Yeah.
but it's, for me at least, and I think that's all I can really say, is it wasn't fun anymore. It wasn't the atmosphere and the world which I had joined many years ago.
Yeah.
Nothing ever is.
Yeah.
But there wasn't the joy that I found anymore in turning on the evening news at 6:30 or 5:30 and knowing every night whether you won or lost.
Yeah.
Did NBC or ABC have a better piece than I did, or did I have the best piece? Nobody cared anymore.
Yeah.
They didn't care. They cared about the ratings and the audience, but they didn't even watch the other stations. So the competition was gone, and they didn't care if you really did, at least in my perception, a really good story that had information and pictures that nobody else had. Well, if you don't have that, at least for me, what are you're just drawing a paycheck,
Yeah.
and you're writing a little bit of fluff over some pictures. And I think Dan Rather and occasionally his folks who work with him, as well as NBC and ABC, they occasionally do some really
Right.
good stuff. I think they did a wonderful job of recently, in the last couple of weeks, covering the so-called Washington Beltway snipers. They really did a fine job in putting it all together, and they're capable of it.
Yeah.
It's just that the demands of the marketplace and the consultants, they wind up doing a little headline service for 7 or 8 minutes, and the rest of it is what I call health and beauty tips.
Right.
That's not my kind of
And of course,
news department.
with respect to overseas corresponding, they took away the opportunity to really know the beat.
Well, there's nothing left. They
Yeah.
basically don't have foreign correspondents anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, they've got
Fly some.
they got a couple of guys in London,
Yeah.
a couple of women in London, they got a guy in Tel Aviv, they got a guy in Moscow. ABC, if memory serves, is closing down its Moscow bureau altogether next month. And a guy in Tokyo,
Yeah.
and that's it. I mean, that's not a foreign. That's
So
a
if
bunch of
something
guys.
happens and, yeah.
That's a bunch of guys standing up in front of something or other and parroting what they just got off of the wires,
Calling around.
because they don't have any money to do anything else.
Right. Let me take you back to something you said. You were a great admirer of Dick Salant. And what did Dick Salant represent to you that was exceptional?
Well, he was not only a wonderful manager, he was an extremely principled man, and he
Mm.
was a lawyer. He died several years ago. He was William Paley's personal attorney. But William Paley was the founder of CBS,
Right.
and was as much responsible for Ed Murrow and
Mm.
CBS's rise to preeminence in broadcast journalism as anybody. Dick Salant wanted to do something else, but besides become Paley's personal lawyer, and he had no journalism background.
Right.
We were all very suspicious of him when he arrived.
Yeah.
We thought, oh, gee, it's just one more suit that's come into the House of Murrow, and he turned out to be the best we ever had, because he, more than I think any of us, really believed in an almost sacred mission of journalism, broadcast journalism, to be honest, to be fair, to be truthful. He wrote up a thick 4-inch book. He loved to write memos of CBS News broadcast standards. We'd had one before, but it was sort of a mess, and he put it together and added to it. And it's a Bible. Nobody, including anybody at CBS, has cracked it open in 20 years, but it's there.
Yeah.
And if I would hope in the next world, if there's a God of news who brings back an honest, decent broadcast news operation that we would all like to see, that's not profit-driven, they're going to find that Dick Salant broadcast standards book and operate by it,
And
because it's there.
And it's there, and
It's the holy grail of
yeah.
broadcast journalism, and that was Salant. And for the period that he was there, he was our pope.
Yeah. Well, as we sort of wrap up here, Richard, I still find some of your writing in some of the newspapers, and I find that you have a book out within the past year, so you're still keeping yourself pretty well occupied.
That's right, and they make me go give speeches and book signings now and then,
Yeah.
so I kind of keep my hand in. But we're looking. Betsy and I are looking for another vehicle. I think it'll be a 1936 Plymouth, but maybe we'll find another vehicle.
Well, and I would expect that you will.
Right.
Well, it certainly has been a remarkable path that you just described for us in the last hour or so, and
It all started in Iowa, and it all started at WMT, and none of it would have happened without that.
well, if that's the case, we're grateful we had some role in launching this career of yours, and it's been a great point of pride, as you have a note from Bill Corton, who
Right.
expressed how proud he was of what you accomplished, and certainly I am. So
Did he say it was the second best idea I ever had?
thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Grant. Great. Well, I remembered more than I thought.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
funny once you get
It
started.
just rolled, you know.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
wonderful, just wonderful stories.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, from